there is this conversation that people are having, hyperbolically or not, about whether or not this conflict could be the beginning of the end of the dollar as a reserve currency. What would have to happen for that to be the case? Now, are we talking about crypto being a reserve currency? Or are we talking about some other significant world powers currency being the stand-in?
That looks pretty unlikely from this point. Now, what I will say is that, and there was a great interview on the Odd Notes? I can't remember, the podcast that's by Bloomberg with Joe Weisenthal and a couple of other people. And they interviewed this guy, I think his name was Zoltan. Yeah, Zoltan Pozar was on this podcast talking about whether or not this is going to mean the end of the dollar as the international reserve currency. And what he was basically saying was, if you start seeing central banks being weaponized in the way that they are, then other central banks around the world are going to start thinking, do I want to hold dollars anymore? And a big part of what underpins the dollar as the currency that's used to clear transactions is the fact that it is held by all of these different central banks, and they all agree that that's going to be the last currency that they kind of use to clear international payments. If a bunch of central banks decide, well, this isn't safe anymore. It's not safe for me to hold assets denominated in dollars. It's not safe for me to hold assets in other central banks. Then what he was suggesting was that you might start seeing a move back to gold. So pegging, for example, the ruble to gold. That would be pretty disastrous in itself for the Russian economy and for any economy that tried to do that. And the reason is that, when you are pegging your currency in that way, you have to kind of take cash out of the economy to use it to buy up your currency to keep it stable. It can be deflationary. And we've seen this historically. It effectively often amounts to the need to impose long-term austerity and also to keep interest rates often very high to stop capital from leaving the economy. So it can really kind of like dampen economic growth at the level of the domestic economy, a peg to gold. So that would be a drawback of that. It's also probably pretty unlikely, seeing as we haven't had any form of gold pegging used at the level of the international economy since the collapse of Bretton Woods in the 1970s. Things have instead generally where they've been pegged to dollars. So there's the question of like what else could be used. Now, crypto, I cannot see any single existing cryptocurrency becoming the international reserve currency. Because again, this is not something that just happens. It is a political change. The point that this guy made was that the big changes that have taken place in currency domination, basically, of like which currency is the dominant of in the world's economy, have taken place during wars. So yeah, for example, the Second World War was the point at which we moved from the kind of dominance of sterling to the dominance of the dollar, properly. That you can see a case for saying that with this weaponization of the central bank, America's enemies have an incentive to think about developing a kind of parallel system that will allow them to transact and trade with one another and, trade with the rest of the world that is not so reliant on the US. The other reason that this kind of seems a little bit more appealing is that after the financial crisis, the US central bank, and this had been used in the past, but it was used really strongly after the financial crisis, had these swap lines with lots of other central banks around the world. And it basically said to a bunch of central banks that were kind of America's friends, we'll give you almost unlimited access to dollars. You will swap your currency for dollars. That's why they were called swap lines. And you can use those dollars then to deal with any problems that are happening in your financial system or to kind of settle debts or stabilize your currency or whatever you want to do. But only America's allies were able to access those swap lines. The network of swap lines was expanded recently, but again, it only includes not that like 15 or so countries. Now, some of those central banks then have their own swap lines with other smaller central banks in their region, but there are still big chunks of the financial system that are excluded from this. And being excluded from it really, again, puts a lot of pressure on you because you need to be able to access dollars for all sorts of transactions and all sorts of, to cover all sorts of liabilities. So, yeah, that is another reason why America, the people the central banks not included in that network would have an incentive to start thinking about alternative arrangements. But again, the question comes back to what else would be used. Now, the long-term idea, I think, is that, as US dominance of the world economy ebbs and China rises, that maybe at some point over the next century, the renminbi will become the global reserve currency instead of the dollar. It's feasible if and when China becomes the largest and most powerful state in terms of not just economics, but also militarily. That's going to take a long time, and also politically. But the stuff that would have to happen between now and then, and I'm not just talking about economics, I'm talking about political stuff. That's a huge change that would have to be, if not agreed to, then at least acceded to by the rest of the world. That is not going to happen anytime soon. It's certainly not going to happen over the next couple of years. The other thing that we can, that is currently used already, are these things called IMF special drawing rights, which are kind of like tokens, I suppose, issued backed against a basket of currencies. So a load of countries put their currencies into a pot, and then the IMF issues, or like countries, these special drawing rights based on the money that's in that pot. So that is supposed to be a way of kind of getting around this question of dollars. You can then change your special drawing rights back into dollars if you have a currency crisis with the IMF. But again, the political will for making special drawing rights the international reserve currency is not there. America gains so much from being able to print the global reserve currency. It has complete freedom in terms of its monetary policy, essentially. It's able to do anything it wants in terms of, interest rates, in terms of money creation. It has, the top hand in terms of everything to do with the international financial system, in terms of regulating it, overseeing it, whatever. That gives it a huge amount of power. And it means that it's effectively able to finance unlimited amounts of spending, nearly. So America's not going to give that up without a fight. And it's not clear who would take it on to try and take that power away from it.
Well, in a world where China continues to grow and ultimately does become the world's reserve currency, doesn't there suddenly become an incentive for America to pivot to an alternative? I mean, is there a world where, in anticipation of that, America would be on board with crypto being a better alternative than having to deal with China?
Well, I mean, there's so much that would have to happen to even get to the point where we're thinking about that. Because I mean, so even before you start thinking about China becoming the dominant international reserve currency, it has to stop basically intervening to peg its currency against the dollar. It would have to let its currency float freely on international markets. And that's not something that it looks like the Chinese state is going to be able to do in the medium term, at least. It's the ambition over the long term, but certainly not in the medium term.
What is the long term? Is that like 50 years?
Well, I mean, the horizons of the Chinese Communist Party, which are far, far longer than the horizons of any government in the rest of the world. Like, their language is the language, yes, of 5-year plans, but also, 5-year plans stacking up on top of one another to really stretch out into the foreseeable future. So this is the very long-term game plan for the Chinese state, but we're talking over several decades now. And ultimately, it is hard to see how that transition happens without some form of military confrontation between China and the US, because the US is not going to give up that power. Like, it's also not something that you can, as a kind of, declining power, it's not something that you can hold on to through sheer force of will, right? Like, the reason that the dollar became the international reserve currency was because American multinationals became very powerful, was because they were exporting lots of oil, they were exporting lots of commodities, and also US consumers were importing lots. And then ultimately, as the US financial system grew, then all other kind of financial institutions around the world also had to come to deal with those financial institutions as well. So there was a kind of level of organic growth that was related to the, expansion, you could say imperialism of US capitalism. Now, interestingly enough, actually, this process is kind of taking place around China already through the network of infrastructure investment projects that it's undertaking throughout mainly Asia, but also, going into Europe and some other countries, Africa, where it is undertaking a lot of investment and like issuing a lot of debt. And what that is doing is already shifting a lot of parts of the world further into the orbit of China. But it's also something that's being fiercely resisted by, the US and the rest of the world. And I mean, the reason a lot of people, I think, didn't think that we would get to this position with Russia, and I think the reason that Putin himself probably didn't think that we would get to this position was that everyone was very, very clear that Biden was focused on China. Biden was focused on the need to cut China down before, its dominance became unchallengeable, really. And that is still something that I think is forefront in the minds of most US policymakers, not primarily at this point because they're worried about the hegemony of the dollar. That's something that's going to, if it does go, take a very, very long time. And as I said, I would be surprised if it would happen without some form of military conflict. But because China is challenging the dominance of the US in a whole load of other ways. And actually, that's kind of a lot of what this comes down to, really. Like, if China finds itself in the position of basically allying with Russia against, and a selection of other countries, potentially India, although that's questionable, against the rest of the world, what you have first, before the move to any kind of, new unitary system, is like the emergence of a bipolar world order again, like the one we had during the Cold War. That has all sorts of implications that affect, everything. Like you could conceivably see a kind of two-speed international financial system emerge, of the same kind that did exist during the Cold War. And that is really the process that we would have to see, I think, before we move to any form of new unipolar world order with just one new superpower that wasn't the US being able to exert complete dominance.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think I've come a long way in my understanding of what a reserve currency is, what cryptocurrency is, and why this all matters. I appreciate that. Before I let you go, though, I want to talk about your most recent piece at the Tribune, which is titled "Punish the Oligarchs, Not the Poor." And this is something that the left has been talking a lot about, before the conflict really popped off last week. There was a conversation ongoing about how, targeting the left is against sanctions. Sanctions hurt the people of these countries that are not at fault. But if Biden really does manage to do these targeted sanctions, then maybe that's okay. We have to respond in some way, was the line coming out of, I think, a good part of the left. Now that we have these aggressive and in some ways unprecedented sanctions that you've been describing in terms of the weaponization of central banks, and we have seen the long lines in Russia and the direct ways that these are implicating a much broader group of people, at the same time that energy is not being sanctioned, and at the same time that there are still these oligarchs, particularly in the UK, owners of soccer clubs, et cetera, who seem to be skirting these sanctions. I want you to talk a little bit about how the left should be looking at this and what kind of skeptical eye we should bring to how sanctions are being applied right now. What should we be advocating for?
Yeah. So, I think, everyone on the left most people on the left are of the view that the kind of primary thing when we're thinking about the emergence of conflict is like, we should always be arguing for peace. We should be agitating for peace. We should be standing with Russian protesters who are agitating for peace. We shouldn't allow imperialist governments, whether that's in Russia or the US or anywhere else in the world, to start conflicts whereby they're sending other people's kids to die, whereby, they are destroying people's lives, and, doing so often with the support and help of very wealthy and powerful interests in the private sector, in the military, and in Russia's case, with the network of oligarchs that surrounds Putin. So, that's the framework that we have to be looking at this from, like, how do we get to peace? And I think alongside that, we should also be looking at this broader question of when governments go to war, they often move first to over military conflict before actually considering what their kind of state, their like domestic economy is doing to facilitate either the conditions that gave rise to that conflict or to enrich the people who are waging that conflict. Now, we know that there is a huge amount of money parked in or passing through the City of London every day, much of which is in some way or another tied to corruption, illegality, war, conflict, all sorts of kind of people smuggling, weapons trafficking, etc. It was not that long ago that HSBC, for example, was fined for laundering money for Mexican drug cartels. And that conflict in Mexico has obviously killed, scores of people. And there are banks that are getting rich off supporting, terrorist organizations, supporting criminal organizations to do their business untroubled. Also supporting kind of dictators to hide their money offshore, and actually often, undermining their own governments by supporting actors to evade sanctions, for example, against Iran, against various different countries. So the first thing really to do when any of this stuff comes up is just to say, and this should be something that obviously should be happening before anyway, but a lot of governments don't have the incentive to do this because, as we've seen in various different leaks, from the Panama Papers to all of these other leaks that have come out recently, they themselves and their friends are often implicated in these networks. So it takes a big push to actually get them to say, no, we're going to put a stop to this. But when something like this comes about, it is, a point at which we really need to be saying, okay, shut down these networks, shut down these flows, make sure that there are processes in place whereby this money that is being moved, there has to be some knowledge of who the ultimate beneficial owner of this money is. Because at the moment, a lot of what facilitates the illegality is just the secrecy that surrounds, the movement of money around the world, particularly when we're thinking about all the secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens that are linked to the City of London and, in the US to Wall Street. So first, insisting on transparency is, I think, the key thing. Now, even that is going to be extremely difficult because when you say transparency, you're not just saying we want all the Russian oligarchs to be revealed. It's a completely open net. If you are forcing open the the underpinnings of this system, everything's going to come up. If you insist on transparency, it's transparency for everything. And that means that a lot of people that the powerful don't want to see implicated are also going to get implicated. So even just pushing for basically transparency when it comes to international financial flows and following the money when it comes to kind of illegality and money laundering, even that is going to be a really big ask and require a lot of really intensive campaigning, as we're seeing at the moment. And, the British government said, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to set up a kleptocracy unit. But as many people, including the brilliant Oliver Buller, who's written a book about this, have shown, the legislation needed to tackle this stuff is already in place. It's just not being enforced whatsoever. So just getting that basic thing done is step number one. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff I think that can be done to actually, encourage peace, by putting pressure on Putin himself. Now, there's been a lot of talk about how, sanctioning the oligarchs, it's just kind of, rearranging the furniture while the house burns. But you have to actually think about the way that political economy works in Russia. We can, the West can try and squeeze the people of Russia to make them put pressure on Putin. But ultimately, he is in control of the military. He can just kill people and arrest them, which is what he is doing and will continue to do for as long as there's a threat to his power. Who ultimately maintains a dictator's place in power? It's the people around him. It's the people in control of the military. It's the power brokers. It's the oligarchs. So putting pressure on those people is going to be really, really important for making him feel the squeeze. And ultimately, I think, we are seeing the beginnings of the end for Putin, largely because he is losing support from the oligarchs who have tacitly or actively supported him for, quite some time now. And that puts him in a very precarious situation. The problem is, of course, is that when you put a dictator like Putin in a very precarious situation, he will just do anything to cling on to power. So there also needs to be diplomatic channels and routes set up to facilitate a peaceful scale back of this conflict and get to, an agreement along the lines of what we saw in 2015. It's not going to solve things over the long run, but the main priority now should just be to de-escalate this conflict. Then over the long run, we need to be thinking about what the West has been doing to create the conditions for conflict in a lot of these places, primarily by the just appalling imperialism, basically, of the world economy, which has kept countries like Ukraine in a position of just extraordinary weakness and dependence and has prevented them from experiencing the kind of development that would, potentially mitigate some of these deep-rooted divisions that exist between people in different parts of the country. And also, we need to be thinking about what response there has been to like the expansion of NATO, why that has been seen as a priority, and like what we can do to create the conditions whereby conflict is not consistently seen as something that is about to happen, which has been the case for the last 5 years at least. You know, Putin has been preparing for this for a very, very long time. And people in the West have known that. And it has been this kind of like staring contest of like who's going to blink first. And when you get into that position, it becomes very dangerous. So, you know, there are lots of things that we need to be doing. But the primary thing, of course, always is trying to get to a position of peace.
Is it truly possible to have genuinely targeted sanctions that hurt oligarchs and aren't affecting the people of Russia?
Yeah, of course, because these oligarchs primarily hold their money outside of Russia. They don't trust Putin. Like, there is very little trust among thieves. Yeah, like a huge amount of wealth in Russia is held offshore. I think it was Adam Tooze, or maybe Sayers, I can't remember, an economist brought up a chart showing all the wealth that is Russian that is held offshore, and it's just a huge amount of that wealth. And bear in mind that the kind of 500 wealthiest oligarchs surrounding Putin have as much wealth as almost the rest of the entire Russian population combined. That is a staggering amount of wealth, and they obviously want to hold on to that. If you start shutting down access to that wealth, and not just doing that, but actually targeting these individuals, so making their lives very difficult, making it difficult for them to move around, making it difficult for, them to put their kids in London private schools or whatever, then you're not just targeting the money, you're also targeting the reputation and their like lives, basically. And why are they often living in London? It's because they want to take their money, leave Russia, go and live nice lives and be part of London society and feel very important. If you shut all of that down, these people are suddenly going to think, right, well, why am I going to continue supporting Putin when he's led us into this conflict, which basically has seen me vilified by everyone else in the country in which I'm living? So yeah, there are definitely ways of doing this that target oligarchs without imposing a huge amount of pain on Russian people.
Yeah, I guess in my mind, I imagine the kind of trickle down effect that happens when you, let's say, the argument stateside is, oh, if you increase taxes on millionaires and billionaires, they'll just raise prices. And you see this happening. You see this happening in the context of the supply chain crisis being used as an excuse to raise prices, and it all gets blamed on inflation. And now there's this ongoing narrative struggle where members on the left are trying to say prices are up because of corporate greed and supply chain issues, not just because of supply chain issues. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and obviously the big factor there is energy. Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, no. So I guess there was a part of me that wondered to what extent some of the costs of sanctions would be passed off by oligarchs into the people of Russia by some way or another, whether or not it's because some of the oligarchs are political, because they are business owners that are able to extract more from the people, things like that. And because things are just so commingled, I just wonder the extent to which you could really parse out and target these kinds of sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, the difference is that Russia's oligarchy is purely almost kleptocratic. When we're talking about, let's say, the American financial business elite, a lot of them get their wealth from exploitation of working people, from links to the government. But some of what they're doing is playing a role in capital accumulation. A lot of what they're doing is playing a role in capital accumulation, is kind of facilitating jobs creation or whatever. I'm not defending these people by saying what they're doing is great, but ultimately, if they were to stop doing that, then yes, it would have an impact on the lives of workers. When it comes to the case of the Russian oligarchs, they are basically purely kleptocrats. They just stole assets that had belonged to the state. These assets were sold off on the cheap, and then they were able to basically reap the rewards of that. And they are now sitting on huge amounts of wealth that was stolen from the Russian people. So it's just a very, very, and I'm not saying that this is a situation that's unique to Russia, because it also takes place, it's very clear in parts of the UK, I'm sure in parts of the US, there are a significant chunk of the capitalist ruling class that are just purely kleptocratic, that have just stolen what they have, whether that's through kind of privatization, through tax avoidance, through just, conflict. And it would be really easy and simple just to say, that it's gone. You can't have it anymore. Potentially, like, say, we're taking this wealth and we'll hand it back to a democratically elected government when Putin steps down, which again, then, gives the Russian people a greater incentive actually to demand his removal.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I've had you for about an hour now, and I'm really grateful that you've been so generous with your time. I want you to tell our audience where they can find you on the internet and find more of your work.
Sure. So I am at Grace Blakeley on Twitter and Instagram. That's Blakeley with 2 E's. So Blakeley. And you can find my books on my website, which are, the link is in my Twitter bio and my Instagram bio. My books are The Corona Crash, How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism, and Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialization.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.